Well, everyone, how's everyone doing today? Well, we are going to demonstrate the power of dev containers pretty much live because there's problems with the video setup and they don't like my laptop. And so I'm going to show you why we're going to use dev containers in Codespaces to easily spin up new development environments and get you started. So as soon as I can get something to display up here, we're going to do everything from scratch on a new laptop or a new environment. I've tried 2 of my adapters. We've tried 2 of their adapters. And I've used this setup at multiple conferences. It just doesn't like, whatever the recording is, it doesn't like this. And I have no idea why. So we will figure it out as soon as something comes up. I've tried to reset things and redetect things, and it's just not liking it. So we'll figure it out shortly. So we don't have any visuals at the moment, but my name is Chris Ayers. I work at Microsoft. I work on the Azure engineering teams, fast track for Azure. I've spoken at a number of NDC conferences. This is my first time here in Copenhagen and my first time here at the Copenhagen Development Fest. And it's been a fun time so far. Did you guys have a chance to see the keynote this morning? Yeah, Dylan is amazing. So, yeah, something is, yeah. So we're just going to have to wait for a couple of minutes until we can get a new laptop, which is coming right now, it looks like. So we should be set up in just a minute. They're all on GitHub, so I just need to sign in. All right. So we're going to talk live around how amazing Codespaces are. All right, come on. Helps if you're used to where the function keys are. And the keyboard layouts. I need slashes. Where's the // Give it.
/ is
Okay, thank you. And we will swap the presenting to duplicate. Come on. Okay, there we go. So let us go and get started. You ever had to do a new laptop live on stage? Because that's what we're doing. And it's cool, because this is a problem I've run into before. And so I've made all of my slides in Markdown. They're all in my GitHub repo. And this is why we talk about using Codespaces. Let's say you're presenting and your laptop dies. And you really want to kind of present, even though your laptop's acting funny, you've done all sorts of prep. You can just bring up your slides right on github.com, hosted on GitHub Pages, and talk about what you want to talk about. So again, my name is Chris Ayers. I'm a customer engineer at Microsoft. You can reach me on all the socials. I'm on all the things. I blog. And all of my slides, all of my samples, all of my demos for all of my talks are out on GitHub at CodeBytes. So today we're going to talk about kind of some prereqs for using dev containers in the way I like to use them with Visual Studio Code, which is probably not installed on that laptop, so we might have to do that live, but we'll figure it out. And otherwise, we'll just do it all in Codespaces. Then we'll talk about what they are, how they work, why we want to use them, and we're going to do a lot of demos of stuff and talking about how to build them from scratch. So when you use VS Code with dev containers, you need to use the dev containers extension. And when you're running dev containers locally, that means you're building and operating on containers on your local machine. This is where you probably want a little bit more powerful machine. You're running containers, you're going to be doing development, you're going to be debugging. Now, if you have a lower-end machine or a problematic machine or a machine with a different architecture or something like that, you can use GitHub Codespaces. You can even code with an iPad as long as you have a network connection. So it really opens up the possibilities to do all sorts of development anywhere you are. So what are these things? I mean, people have probably used Docker for a long time, used images, like, hey, I spun up a dev container or a Docker container for my development practices. Well, these are actually a thing that has a formal specification. But they are environments that you put in a container. These are, there's tooling that lets you mount and open your file system. It does port redirection. It does all sorts of things to handle the plumbing and the wiring up of stuff for you. And inside your dev container, you're going to want all of your apps and tools that you need to build and to debug your solutions. But what's awesome about using like the dev container specification and the dev containers is it also lets you use your own themes and settings in UI. So when we use these, one way is to onboard new people. Have you guys ever started at a new company and tried to get your dev machine set up? How long did that take you? Who got it in a day? A week? A month? Longer than a month? Yeah. Had to ask for licenses. Where do I put this file? What version of the thing did we install so that I made it run right? Like, who's installed the wrong version of something before? Like, you just installed the latest one off the internet, and when you tried to run the program, it broke because they were 3 versions back or locked on a thing. It's never happened, right? Think about that challenge for that new employee that you're trying to onboard, or somebody you're bringing onto a team, or if you're maybe a consultant working on multiple projects that have conflicting versions and conflicting installs. That's never happened either, to nobody. So being able to onboard people very quickly, being able to have that consistent version and tooling, that is really nice. When you tell someone, hey, we're using like Pylint, and we have these settings that we want to run on it against our Python, everybody's using the consistent thing. And also, because of how dev containers are, you can have all sorts of different hooks into the system. So every time you create the container, every time you start it up, maybe you want to run like an npm install. Maybe you need to do some sort of like pip install or NuGet restore. You can automate a lot of these common tasks so that they just automatically happen every time you bring up your container. Now, dev containers help to optimize that inner loop and a little bit of the outer loop. So, this is where we have our debuggers, our CLI tools that we need for like the Azure CLI, AWS, GitHub. We have things like compilers and SDKs, Node and Python, Java. Maybe we've had extensions to those or different other command line utilities. All of these things that we use to tweak and set up our system, we can codify it into a dev container. Instead of having to ship your machine, you can ship your machine config, essentially. It's really nice. And that's fully isolated from what the app needs to run when you're running in production. And we all know this from multi-stage Docker images where we have our build part of our Docker image where we have the SDKs and the development tools, and then we copy the artifacts to a runtime type of image with containers. So this is optimizing that development loop for ourselves. Now, what's awesome about using them with VS Code, and even to a degree with Codespaces, is on your local machine, you can run VS Code with your themes, make it the font you like, the size you want, copy and paste, all of that. All of the themes and extensions that you have and the source code is on your local machine. But when you start up your dev container, it actually spins up the backend VS Code server runtime inside that container. It mounts the file system. It's going to have all of the terminal processes. It's going to have the application, the debugger, and there'll be like volume mounts and port mappings that happen for you. All of this is codified in that dev container config file. And there's a lot of complexity into it, and we'll dive into that. So in VS Code, when you just have it and you have the dev container extension, if you bring up the command palette, like Control-Shift-P, you can add dev container configurations files. These live in your project. These live in your repo. They're checked in with your code because it is the environment you build your code against. And there's a ton of things to build your dev container on. You can do an Alpine image if you want something really small and light. I use Debian a lot just because it has a base consistency for me, and just like with every other type of container, if all of my dev containers use Debian, once I pull the first one, each additional one I pull, the image already exists. I'm just building on top of it. But there's a lot of different choices beyond just like base image. There's a ton of templates around like maybe a base OS, maybe around a tool or a language, or even focused on something like Kubernetes, or if you're doing blogging, Jekyll. So again, forgive me for dealing with this laptop that I'm not used to, but you can see there are a ton of templates. We can search. These are maintained by the dev container spec community, so there's some spec maintainers, and you can see that right here. So we have stuff like Alpine. Maybe we want to do Python, Anaconda, C++. Maybe we just want to use an existing Docker file or a compose file, and we want to extend that. Maybe you're building Docker images inside your dev container, which is running in Docker, so you need to think about Docker in Docker or Docker outside of Docker. Like, they have some of these already out there. And besides all of the one that the community puts out, or the spec maintainers puts out around all sorts of different languages and capabilities, there's also community-supported templates. So people have identified a need on, hey, I want to build like a base image that has, there's a Julia. We've got an Azure Functions one, so they've already added in some of the Azure Function capabilities. There's some Fabric runtime, MiniForge. So there's lots of different options to build your template off of. And if we just had to deal with a template, cool. I mean, you can give it your own custom Docker file. But in addition to templates, we can configure it. So your dev container lives in a .dev container folder in the root of your project, and that is a devcontainer.json file. So it has a format. You can give it a Docker file if you want. You can just build off a base image. This is actually an older style of dev container, so I'll show you, but you can add in your extensions, you can add in settings, you can configure ports and users, but then you can customize it. Some of the features available, some of the things available in that dev container file are features, which I want to dive into. So features are like additional layers to add to your Docker file. You can just pick individual components that you want, like a CLI or a tool, like I want to have kubectl, I want to have Terraform. Or you can have a runtime, like I need .NET installed in this Python app because I'm doing an extra component. So if we go and look at some of the features that are out there, there we go. Again, you can see we've got different CLIs that are maintained, but the thing about this is you can add individual components. Maybe it's a package that you want to add from apt, or a package you want to add from Python. I was trying to do a talk on secure Terraform and secure infrastructure as code, and Trivy was not in the list of tools I wanted to add. I didn't want to add a custom Docker image that I tweaked every time and had to maintain. I didn't want to have a startup script that I had to run every time. I was like, there's got to be a better way. And so there's good documentation here on how to add tools in the features. And so I actually went out to, you'll see that there's a lot of like different groups that can, that add to the feature set. So I added to one of the projects out there, it was like dev containers contrib, and I added a couple security tools. And you can check your OS, like is this an Ubuntu based, is this Alpine based? Here, go get the latest exe, or go get the latest binary from GitHub, download it from the releases, install it in this path. And so you can customize this and add and pick and choose the individual features or components that you need to help build and develop your application. It's really, really powerful. Now, I will say there's a little bit of a trade-off. So when you're building a Docker image and you have a Docker file, then you specify your Docker file as part of your dev container thing. it usually builds and is pretty quick. When you start adding a ton of features, you might start getting performance slowdowns just on the building a new container image. So once you get above like 2 or 3 features, you start getting a whole list of features, you might want to think about looking at a custom Docker file, just for the feature set. And let me go back out to the containers. Somehow I have cap lock on. Yes, go away. All right, so let us look real quick at one of the newer spec files. Like for Go, you can see we've got up here, we got Docker file. We can give it args. So if we want variants or different arguments for our Docker files, we can do that. We can even give it additional run arguments when it runs the base Docker image. We've got rules for tool-specific configurations. And I'll show you how to find these. But for VS Code, we can actually set individual settings on the editor itself. So if you bring up your command palette, you bring up your UI settings, you could go find go.toolmanagement.check for updates. You can find that setting in the settings UI. And when you load this dev container, it will set those 3 properties for you inside that dev container. So if you have a team that's all using Go and you want them to have the same set of settings, you can configure those. If you want to make sure everyone that runs your dev container has certain extensions installed, this will install those extensions for when you use that dev container. So it gives you a ton of cool flexibility. And that specification is actually pretty in-depth if you look at it. So, and I'll show you how we can have additional customization, but this will give you every possible option available if you dive into it. If you're trying to like really understand and dig deep, we get like post, create, and start commands, so we have some hooks to run scripts. We can specify users and environments. And let me go back to our slides for a second before we get deep into the demos. We also have things like Codespaces. So what's ideal about Codespaces is it uses the exact same dev container specification file that we're using in IDEA and VS Code. So the 2 editors on-prem, the dev container CLI, which is their reference implementation, they're all using the same specification spec file, and Codespace uses that as well. And so, like I said, let's say your laptop doesn't project at a conference that you need to present and have set up, and you just get a random laptop where you can log into GitHub. I can now log into my Codespace and bring up and show you guys demos, even though I don't have it running on my machine, because I can run Codespaces out of GitHub. And I can have from 2-core up to like 32-core machines, up to 64 gigs of RAM. And if I don't have a dev container specified, if I didn't go through that process of making a spec file for dev containers for my project, it will load the GitHub Universal container. And that has a whole big set of tools. But they only offer Linux, and we only offer x86-64 as the image. So you can't do Mac OS, you can't do ARM Codespaces right now in the cloud. It's really only going to be x64 Linux. And so you can actually connect to Codespaces from a number of different IDEs locally. You can use VS Code on your desktop, and it will actually connect to the image running in the cloud. You can run cloud-based VS Code, which is what I'll probably be doing in just a second. You can use some of the JetBrains IDEs, so IntelliJ, Golang, RubyMine, and then you can also use the GitHub CLI to SSH into a dev container and just build and work from there. So you have a couple of different options, and just like before, we have our VM, we have our source code, our languages, our tooling, all running in an isolated environment in the cloud. So let's go play with some of these. I think I'm going to need to log in now, which, yep, we will figure out. Nobody peek. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties. This just makes it more real. I think it's more interesting this way, because you'll see how we really use them, or at least how I really use them. All right. Oh, crap, I have special characters. This is going to be a problem. Hold on. Well, we'll see what happens. Okay. So I just want to double check some special characters here so I can see what the heck I'm doing. That is not a star. All right, so I just got to figure out where the star is, and I should be okay. Oh, there's a star key. Sorry, different foreign language keyboards. Me problem, sorry. And I will be changing my password later. There we go. Always use 2FA or MFA. The GitHub app is great for that. So, all right. So, I brought up the Codespaces templates page. So, let's just say I'm on a random browser and I want to do some React code. So I can say I want to use this template. And what this will do is, I don't know if you see at the top left, I've got a unique name for my code space. So this is a unique permanent URL so I can access it in the web. And notice it's loading up Visual Studio Code in the web. So I'm in my browser. Now I could be on an iPad, but I'm in a browser and signed in, and I've got some React app. I'm getting syntax highlighting. I'm getting a terminal. Notice it's doing an npm start. So I didn't do anything. It automatically did a npm start for me using Vite. And I've got a little message here like, hey, you can reload instantly, maybe? Let's just, I can't type, so. But you notice, instantly, there we go. I'm getting live reload. So there's npm running behind the scenes. I've got the tooling already wired and set up, and I loaded my code space, and I'm working. How much setup did I do? Does that beat some of your new employee setup time for being able to work in a code base? A little bit? Considering it's literally a new laptop. All right, so yeah, you can see that I've got some extensions installed. Some of them I'm synced over, but it's got other extensions that are being added for the UI. I've got access to Git, and I can do all the things I need to do. Now, one thing a lot of people don't realize, and I'll just go ahead and go to GitHub now that I'm signed in, is you can come up here to your name, and you can go down to settings. So let's say you don't want to use VS Code in the browser. Maybe you don't like that. So there's Codespaces. Who uses dot files? Anybody use dot files? Notice if you have dot files, you can bring them with you into your code space. So if you're used to having all of your aliases and your scripts and your environment set up and tweaked exactly the way you love, you can bring them with you. And you can have the dot files automatically installed. And there's some documentation here on how to set up dot files for Codespaces if you need help with that. Let's say we want to talk to OpenAI. I like to do Azure AI chatbots and tooling, and maybe I have an endpoint set up. I can make a Codespace secret. Maybe I need an access key for something. Maybe I need a connection string. I can save Codespace secrets for myself that only I can use in my Codespaces, and I have control over that. I can enable GPG signing on all of my commits, so I know it's coming from me. I can continue to do what I normally do with VS Code, which is sign in and synchronize my settings and my changes. So as I customize my environment, my theme, my font, my layout, that moves with me everywhere I go, from on my device to in the cloud. We can have some really limited stuff. You can say you trust all of your repositories, or you can actually dial it in to some very limited, selected repositories. So I can say I really only need to sign the ones that work, and then I can come through here and I can pick the individual repositories, or I can say I want to do it for all repositories. Same with access. Maybe Codespaces for personal can be allowed to talk to other ones, so you have a lot of control on access rights and limitations. And then here, you'll notice, where do I want to open Visual Studio Code? So I don't have it installed, and I don't know if they want me to install stuff, but I'll install it anyways, and we'll deal with the ramifications later. It'll be fine. Do a user system one. Again, new machine. So once you, for this one, I usually try to install 2 different extensions. I install the GitHub Codespaces extension, and then I install the dev container extension. Like these are the 2 I usually install. Just because once I do settings sync, everything moves around and moves over. But the Codespaces extension lets you connect out to those GitHub Codespaces running instances, and it actually lets you manage them from Visual Studio Code. So it's really, really nice tooling. And if you also do GitHub Actions, install the GitHub Actions extension. It's incredible. It lets you manage the variables and look at the runs of all your workflows and stuff. And of course, Copilot, because Copilot's just amazing. Like, if you're not using Copilot, you should definitely play with it. So, in addition to, and while that's working in the background, let's just get here, get our Codespace extension. Boom, install. You can see we because we're running in the cloud, we can adjust our timeout. Maybe we just want our machine to go to sleep after a certain number of minutes. We do get a certain amount of free minutes as personal users every month. I think it's 60, and that varies on if you go up to 32 core or 16 core. I think it goes down from there. Like 2 core, you get a lot more. Organizations also get some minutes for their users. Definitely something to check out. You have options on like how much you upgrade your host images or which regions. Because some organizations and some people worry about data sovereignty, they don't want their code and their machines running in a different region. Like, you can control that. So let's go back to playing with some of these code spaces. Let's see if this finished. It did. Let's see if I need to sign in. Yep, sign in to GitHub. Already signed in. Cool. So now that I've got, you can see I've got some code spaces over here. So I've got a couple. So one of the cool things with this is like I can attach to one that's already running or attach to one that I previously created. And you'll see opening remote at the bottom left. This will always tell you if you're running on WSL, if you're running in the cloud, if you're running, no, okay. This is not, that might not work, but we'll see. So yeah, there we go. I was able to connect. So you can see I'm in that code space in the cloud, but I'm in my local VS Code. I'm no longer working in a browser. I'm connected to that connection out to Codespaces. And I can still run and edit, so I can go find my simple browser. There's my instantly. Remember I typed instantly, and if I come in here and I take this off and save it, and we check out simple browser, like it's still running. It didn't stop running. I pretty much moved the connection from the web browser to my local VS Code. So I can have a little bit more control over Zoom, copy, paste, tons of fun stuff. Now notice here is our dev container. It's sitting in that .dev container folder at the top left. Now this time it doesn't use a Docker file. It's using an image. And just like I said, it's using the universal dev container image out on Codespaces. This one, and you can specify requirements. So for instance, this says it needs 4 CPU. You can specify 2, you could specify, like I need 8 gigs of memory. You have control over like how much you need. Every time I start the thing, it's gonna start the content. It'll do an npm install, it'll do an npm start. I can have it automatically open files for Codespaces so it loads right up onto the page I need to edit. I have that port mapping. Whoops, that's not the one. Come on, keyboard. Where are you at? Where are you at? All right, well, let's see if I can do it this way. Terminal. I just want to see the terminal. Nope, not that terminal. This is annoying me just because ports. I was just trying to bring up the thing that I closed so I could see the port panel at the bottom. View toggle ports. There we go. So at the bottom, it adds a new capability that you're going to see called ports. And so when you run an application locally, Dev Containers actually detects that and picks up on it, and it tries to do port mapping for you. So, it's running some sort of node thing on port 3000. And if you look at the browser at the top, I don't know if you can see that, I'm connected to localhost 3000. We're not running anything locally. This is actually running in GitHub, in the cloud. It's doing redirection from my local browser and my local tooling, port 3000, out to GitHub to let me play around with my application. And so you can actually see this here. This is private visibility. So if I gave this to you to connect, you wouldn't be able to access it. Now I can come here actually and change my visibility. Let's say I'm doing some changes in some code and I need someone to look at it and validate it and say, hey, I want to double check that change you made. I can make this public, and now it's redirected, and you can even see the port is baked into the thing. I can share that URL with someone to go validate. And it's actually a lot of fun if you go to it in a, I'm going to hurt myself, aren't I? Let's see here. In private window. Yeah, so you're about to access someone else's development thing. So don't think that people are going to use GitHub to try to be like, hey, look, I made a Bank of America. This gives you an indication that you're going to a development site and a development port. And I can look at it. Pretty cool stuff? Yeah. So if you have VS Code and you have the development thing, actually I didn't install that one, so let me install the development dev containers because I want to show you. This machine, I'm guessing, does not have Docker, so I won't be able to go all the way to Docker. But this is the dev container extension. This is the one I recommend if you have a more powerful machine and you don't want to do it in the cloud and you want to play around locally. Once you install this extension, it actually has a number of things it installs as far as options. What's great, so if I look at my remote extension, I'm seeing information about my current code space, but if I go dig, there should be a dev container one. I might need to just restart. But it'll show you all the volume mounts that you're using. If it makes a volume mount to store information about the image, if you pulled down the Python image, you can see the images you pulled, the ones that are running, the ones that aren't. What's really, really cool is the first time you pull it locally, it could take 3 to 5 minutes if it has to pull a couple megs of data or a gigabyte of data, depending upon the base images. But the second time you run it, it's almost instant. So let's see if we can shut this guy down or tweak it in some way. So I can rebuild it. So if I rebuild it, this is what you'll normally see locally when you're rebuilding images. If you've done something, you can usually track and monitor them. So you'll see, yeah. See, it's pulling images, it's attaching, and then boom, now we're in it, installing my dot files. it reset up everything. So you can, here we go, let me scroll back up. Yeah, using this base image, creating the container, everything's very transparent, and you can see all the information. Now let's do a little bit more exploring. So we've got those GitHub things, templates. These work kind of across the board. There's all sorts of different ones. Let me go to my repo, and I want to show you a couple of things. And then there's a few amazing repos I'd like you to see. All right, I'm going to undo that just so I can get back to, there we go. Thank you for bearing with my inability to operate in a different country. So there's my dev container folder. Notice I don't have a dev container file. I have subfolders, because guess what? You can have more than one container, dev container, in your project. You could have it for like a front-end persona or a back-end persona. You can have all sorts of different capabilities. Like, I do all my slides in Markdown in GitHub, and guess what? I have a container for that based on Bullseye. And I have some settings I built in and some extensions I want to use every time. So I don't have to worry about if I have those extensions installed. I can just load up this dev container and work on my slides. But what about if I want to show off some cool stuff about Codespaces? Well, I can use my Debian base image again. I can install a feature for the GitHub CLI. I have a little cool thing here called secrets. They're kind of fun. Why don't we make a dev container here, and I'll show you. So I can go to just code, and instead of like checking out my code with the CLI, GitHub repo clone, I can go to Codespaces. And so I can just hit plus, and this will use my default dev container, which is .devcontainer / devcontainer.json. I don't have one, so it's, I actually want to do something different. I want to use options. So I can pick a branch. If I'm doing a pull request, I could open a code space right on the pull request and just do it right from there. But I'm going to be on my main branch. There's my two configurations. I get to play around with them. So I can come in here and say I want to make a code space for my code space. I can pick my region. I can pick my size. And then look at this. Maybe I'm building something and it's like, hey, you're doing some front-end work for a back-end API. We suggest when you spin up a code space, you put in your API key. That's pretty cool, right? Now, you don't have to do these. You can. But I can just create the code space, and it's doing it in the browser. I forgot I didn't want to do that. So I'm going to just close that. Or not close that. Let's see if I can go back. Yeah, I want to leave that. Challenges are real. The struggle is real. All right, so let's go back down here to Codespaces, and let's change. I want it to run in Visual Studio. So notice I clicked. I didn't have to save. I just clicked. So I'm going to go back to my dev containers repo. I'm going to go back to Codespaces. That's the one I just ran. Like I can tweak code. I can tweak the size, I can change it, I can have it auto-delete, I can open it in my browser, I can open it in Visual Studio Code, and this pops up and says, hey, GitHub wants to open VS Code. Okay, let's do that. Hey, GitHub wants to open this URL. Cool, let's do that. So I'm just developing locally, but I'm not. I'm connecting, but. There we go. So this is my dev container stuff. Now, now that we have the extension, so if I want to do like add dev container files, this will modify mine or create a new one. If I say create a new one, here's the stuff we talked about. I can show all the definitions. Let's say we want to work on Python. So got a little check mark. It's not blue. They didn't pay $8, but I can see that's one of the official supported ones. because standards and quality, all that. So we'll do Python. We got a whole bunch of variants. So if there's a certain version of Python you need, maybe based on Bullseye or Bookworm or a certain version of Debian, you can do that. So let's just do that. And now we get to the tools. I usually do a lot of tools. I like the GitHub CLI. I like the AZ CLI. I will usually do the Azure Developers CLI when I'm building my tools. Notice I'm just checking boxes as we go. Like maybe some of you guys are big fans of like Terraform, and we have a lot of community ones, and then we have the official one that has tflint and tfgrunt. So cool, let me do that. Just keep the defaults. And what you'll see is it added a new file. It added it just right here at the root of the .dev container folder. And there are my 4 features I asked for, right? Let me, let me zoom in a little bit. I just want to make sure you guys can see okay. You guys see okay? Yeah. So there's the 4 things I picked. We just did the options. What if instead I wanted to do something else? What if instead this one's missing, or let me see here, Codespaces. It might be a Codespaces extension. Yeah, because of how I'm running right now, I'm just going to make a new one. I'm going to show you the thing, but it's because of how features, or if you're inside a dev container, it doesn't like you modifying the dev container file a lot. Like on my local machine, usually I'll reopen my environment in WSL or locally. I'll edit my dev container file, and then I'll go back into my dev container just to tweak stuff. But for instance, let's say we want, I do the AZ CLI again and the GitHub CLI. Let's actually look at the options this time. And I said AZD, and I said Terraform. So we're going to do OK. This time we're going to configure options. So each of those features, if you want, you can configure options. Like I want to install the CLI with Bicep, and that one, get it from a GitHub release. And this one, we're going to do the latest version, and this one, I want to install TFSec also. And yeah, that's fine. Latest version of these various tools. So now if we look at this, I didn't hit overwrite. I hit skip. Darn it. Gonna do this real quick. There we go. Third time's the charm. We got this. Boom, that'll work. Configure. Yep. Cool. Perfect. There we go. Notice we've got all of the different options for our feature. Well, how do we know what features are there? How do we know how to configure them, and how do we build our own? Well, let's go back to the spec file. Let's go back to the specification. Here's all the available features. We looked at this a little bit ago, right? So let's look at that Terraform one, for instance. See, I can filter down. I can click on this. If it's a feature and you can install it, it's on GitHub and it's public. It's not a private thing. There's no question about what's happening. Go out to it and look at what it does. You can. Like, no secrets. Nobody's hiding anything. But what's awesome is they show you how to configure it. Just like the GitHub Marketplace, which is awesome and I love. Like, they show you like the OSs that are supported, like the features you can put in here, like they give you stuff. So you have an amazing capability to customize your environment for your project. In fact, this is what many organizations do. I'm gonna do a silly thing, and I'm gonna copy a slash so I can paste it. Don't judge me. All right, so anybody ever use Python here? Anybody use Python? A couple people? Okay. So do you know who uses dev containers? Can you take a guess? Python. Look at this. There's our dev container folder in CPython, the core engine of Python, right there. They got a Docker file and they have a dev container file. So they build their Docker image. They have some additional commands on create. They have some commands on when you like restart it and update it, like post create. They want to like fix some permissions. They have specific customizations. So they have specific extensions that they want you to have installed if you are working on CPython. They have specific settings, like about the compiler and the defines and stuff. So you don't have to go through this huge document, set this thing here, put this in this path, do this. They've already done it for you. They even have consistent editor stuff. I mean, they could use an editor config, but they baked it in here as well. Pretty neat. Anybody use Home Assistant? Yeah, and so this is just their normal, this is their Docker file that they used to build out. Anybody use Home Assistant or any sort of home automation? Guess what they use? Don't get me on the dashes now, come on. Home Assistant, yep, there we go. Home Assistant, it's your friend. Let's look at core. The core of the project. Oh, what's that? Dev container. So major, huge open source projects out there are doing this. Inside Microsoft, we're doing this. I'm sure inside GitHub, they're doing this. This is something that is being leveraged and used to help onboard people, help remove some of those obstacles, those consistency problems. And I put it in pretty much every single one of my projects because I do a lot of different samples at different times. If you're a consultant, if you're building stuff, codify your machine, codify your build environment so that you don't have to worry about it and lose it. And look at this. Isn't this, like these are all the things you know you need to do, and they're all codified. Now, I highly recommend if you're interested in this in depth, containers.dev. I've got the links in my slides. So we've got the container templates and features and tutorials. There's a beginner series, so let's just go through this. We've got all the templates, so you can come in here and look and figure out what your options are, all the features. Visual Studio Code has a whole dev container section. Like it is a huge section on dev containers that has attaching them, using them, playing with the different scenarios. There's some advanced options in here, so maybe you want to use a compose file, using different environment variables, mounting drives, working with different users. It's really powerful. I also have run into some issues which I want to point out. I want to find the, I think it's under improve performance. Yeah, I always use WSL on these. You can do named values, like you can actually clone right into it. There's some weird issues, like, so if you're normally a Windows user, okay, and you clone your stuff into Windows, and then you do a dev container on it, dev containers are always in Linux. So you're trying to do Linux permission model on top of Windows file system, sometimes it acts funny, and you can get some performance issues. I usually use WSL. I clone into WSL, and then I start code from there, and then I do dev containers. Or another thing you can do in VS Code is, if you do clone, I probably need to restart VS Code, just so that dev containers, come on. Yeah. It's got to load the extensions. There we go, dev containers. So there is normally an option, and it's probably because I'm remote. File, new window, you go away. Nobody cares about you. There we go. There. So you can clone a repo right into a container volume. So it'll clone it right into Docker. It'll make a volume for your code. Then it'll build a Docker image and attach it on top of that like a persistent volume. So you don't have the code sitting necessarily on your file system. You have it sitting in a cloned container volume, but the performance, it's way faster, is something I found. The other thing I was going to say is naming. So you'll see it in a bunch of my repos, but this is also in the Visual Studio Code tips and tricks. So there's a lot of cool tips and tricks in here, but one thing I've found is that you start having line ending issues. So you check it out in Windows, it has certain line endings. You then mount it in Linux that expects different line endings. The first time you open up your project, it says every single file's changed, when it hasn't. So the solution is you add a git attributes for auto end of line. Like you can do that, and you'll actually see that in my own repos. Like you'll see that it exists there, just as something to help you get around that problem. So going back to my code. And with that, that's really all I have. We got a couple more minutes for questions, so I want to make sure that if you guys had some questions, I could help address those. Anybody have anything? All right, yes? Yeah. Yeah. It's about the same. It's just the problem with, cool, I still had the slash. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I had the slash still. Containers. Yeah. So I just add, like this one I just add for all of my things in case I clone it on Windows and then I open a dev container. This fixes the line ending problem. Another problem I've seen, has anyone ever opened a Git repo and it says, do you trust this repo? You ever seen that? Did you know you could make it go away? Well, I make it go away. With git config global add safe directory, and guess what? There's variables in dev containers. So you can use variables to know the workspace folder or the current user and stuff. So you could do little tricks like this to automate some of those problems away. Anybody else? Well, thank you guys for coming. Please make sure you vote on your way out. Just grab the greens, hopefully. And they've frowned in the past when I said grab a handful. They only want you to do one at a time. But you could stand there for a minute and do one at a time. Well, no, she's shaking her head. I shouldn't say that either. Don't do that. Just one or two. Well, just one. Thank you, guys. And again, a talk on a different laptop, Codespaces. No, like, that's my laptop. I'm pissed about it. But it worked.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. Very impressive. Make sure you sign out of the Codespaces.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. I need to sign out of all the things.